Welcome to the Southampton Education School Research Seminar Series. I am Achla Gupta. I'm a lecturer and program coordinator of our seminar series. Our events are open to all. We aim to facilitate meaningful conversations and contribute to advancement in the field of education. Thank you so much for your interest in this event. I hope you enjoy it. Please feel free to visit our website for details about our upcoming events.
Today, I am going to present around what I have actually realized in practice as an education economist. I've called them dilemmas, drawbacks, and trade-offs entailed in reforming a national education system of especially a poor country like Uganda. We very well take note that a majority of the countries actually use education and health provision as a tool to show presence of government. But also we know that the education that they try to give to their citizens is aimed at solving personal, regional, and national problems. And this is assumed to come from education through passing on relevant knowledge, skills, attitudes, and values. So the time I've spent as a chief government education strategist, I found out that most of the countries confer a lot of responsibility to the education sector actors to ensure that the kind of education and training that they provide suits the individual needs, the community needs, and the national needs. In practice, I've realized that this tension between what is taught or what is supplied or what is trained and the actual needs of the nation, the actual needs of community still exists. There is a wide gap, and partly this gap is reflected in the slow school to work transition globally. Okay, so for countries that were colonized like Uganda, we have always engaged in a blame game, indicating that the curriculum that was left for us was not meant for us. And this narrative is ongoing. And so majority of the countries that were colonized previously have spent a lot of time, and a lot of them are still spending a lot of time and effort to try and align their education systems and training to the needs of the individuals, the community, and the nation. Uganda particularly has really undergone through several education reforms in trying to align the curriculum that was left by the colonial master Britain to the society needs. I just hinted on a few reforms that I have witnessed coming. Some of them I have read about. Right from pre-independence, mind you, Uganda got independence in 1962 from Britain. But prior to that, there were so many education commissions that were sanctioned by the Queen's government. And one of them was headed by Phelps Stokes, which was named after him in 1925. And the reform by then was to get the education system from the hands of the missionaries who had come to Uganda in the 800s, for it to have a national flavor, because they found that the missionary education was tailored to train church catechists and the evangelists who would get or take the religious message to get converts. So the colonial government, through an instrument, they got the education from the hands of the missionaries into the colonial government's hands. But mind you, what didn't change was the ownership of schools, because the missionaries continued owning the schools that they had constructed. In 1973, Uganda decided to localize or Africanize the curriculum across the entire education system by establishing the National Curriculum Development Center. And they wanted mainly to vocationalize it, because by then the country needed mainly to be constructed and repaired. And later on, we liberalized and privatized education. We introduced cost sharing at tertiary education level, and we declared primary and secondary education free and universal. Remember that prior to 1992, majority of the schools were government-owned schools. And there were really very few private schools, mainly owned by the Indian communities. In 1997, that's when we decided that government would provide free primary education, and it was going to be universal. 10 years after 1997, we declared free universal secondary education. We decentralized the provision of primary and secondary education to be provided by the local authorities, a function that was prior performed by the central government. So currently, the local authorities hire and fire, and they provide the different inputs using the grants that they get from the central government. Recently, we have come up with a reform to allow the reintegration of teenage mothers back into the formal school system. This has not really received a lot of support by the different education actors. They have mixed feelings about it. And so the policy has not really taken shape. It has not been widely implemented. So a lot of young girls who get pregnant in Uganda drop out of school. And Uganda has one of the highest teenage pregnancy rates, with around 1 out of every 4 teenage girls is likely to be pregnant. That's around 25%. But some districts have 40% of pregnant mothers being of teenage age. Also recently, we came up with a reform of making all natural sciences in secondary schools compulsory. Previously, learners would opt out of natural sciences, but because the country wants to build a strong foundation for sciences, we made them compulsory. And also, we had another reform, that is the affirmative action, because previously higher education was dominated by men or boys with very few females. So government decided to give added advantage in terms of points that would allow more girls to enter universities and other tertiary institutions in compared to boys. The way this works is that if a boy and a girl score the same points, if those points are below those required by the university, the government can give a bonus point if it is the only thing the girl needs to enter the university, meaning that the girl is most likely to join the university with the same points with the boy who would be left out of that. Of course, the policy has so many mixed feelings as well. We have registered successes and failures out of the reforms that we've implemented, and I leave you to judge where you see as if we've failed, where we've succeeded. But I think one of the successes is the increase in the national literacy rates. Of course, this is a surprise to some of you who live in developed countries that have above 90% of people being literate. For us, we're just hitting around 80% being literate, and more men are literate than women. But although we increased the access to education, especially at primary schools, where we have 10 million children, we have not succeeded in retaining these children to complete the primary cycle. Our primary cycle is 7 years, having 7 grades. So if you do a cohort analysis, you find that 40% of the learners, some statistics say 38% of the learners who enroll in primary 1, which you would call grade 1, actually complete. Now, this shows a lot of wastage along the journey. Most of them, 60% drop out. But also, we realize that in terms of proficiency in the gateway subjects, that is mathematics and literacy, about 50% of the learners in primary schools are reaching the expected proficiency. And we see that still a lot of students who complete primary school education do not transition to secondary. And that is 1 in every 3 children who attend primary school does not proceed to secondary. And actually, one of the biggest successes that we've achieved through these reforms is achievement of enrollment at primary school. We have a 1-on-1 for girls to boys. We still have more boys in secondary schools than girls at a ratio of 80%. So where you find 10 boys, you find 8 girls within secondary education. We also realize that whereas we've achieved a lot in trying to increase enrollment at secondary education through the reforms, we have not achieved proficiency, especially in the science subjects. Now, at tertiary, we only have 0.7% of the total population. Uganda's population is 42 million. Being enrolled in tertiary education. So you see a broad-based education system with so many enrolled at primary, but it starts getting trimmed off at secondary and then at tertiary. As a government education strategist, I've noticed a lot of dilemmas that planners, policymakers go through when they are trying to develop areas of reform, when they are trying to implement the approved reforms, And one thing that I've realized is that across Africa, majority of the reforms don't get implemented, actually. Currently, Uganda has just appointed another education policy review commission to look into the education policies and see whether they are still aligned to the needs of the individuals consuming this education and the country. But one thing I realized why these reforms don't get implemented is that we have a dilemma of trying to bite too much. I'll give you an example. The 1989 Education Policy Review Commission came up with about 200 reform suggestions. And the assessment indicated that till now, only 50% have been implemented. And when you go deeper into this, you realize that whereas we are still poor countries, we plan for reforms that would require very big budgets and resources that we may not have. And so the reforms remain on paper and gather dust. The other dilemma that I've realized or that I have observed is the conflicting logics of the education reforms. I have realized a lot of tension between the reforms favored by the different constituencies within the education sector. For example, you may find that whereas government would wish to have all the children in school, some parents, because of culture and the religious dogmas, may not see that logic. Or some families may not understand that logic of why government is trying to get all children in school, because they think that that will deny them of labor to work in the fields. Other families may think that children going to school, particularly girls, may deny them of wealth that they would get if that girl was prepared for marriage. So you find that there is always a tension between the different spheres of influence. Even the donors, for them, they may be focused on very different areas. And so it becomes a very significant dilemma for education planners. Now, the other dilemma that I realized is that majority of the countries tend to, they fail to scale what has worked. And in most cases, we tend to rush for omnibus changes, new kind of reforms, without trying to take stock of what has actually worked and how can we then scale that up. For example, in Uganda, evidence has showed that children having access to early childhood care and education forms a stronger background for them to remain in school and achieve higher. Even though we have that evidence, we've not invested a lot in trying to scale up access to that. The other kind of intervention that, in my view, had started working in one of the nomadic areas of Uganda, that is northeast, where the Karamojong live. These people own a lot of cattle, and they keep moving from one place to another in search of pasture and water. And so most of their children do not attend school. Actually, they have a 6% enrollment rate at primary and even lower than 6% at secondary, because children have to be on the move with their parents to look for greener pastures and water. Now, there was an intervention or a reform where mobile schools were implemented in the region. So the teachers would always look for the children wherever they are herding the animals and teach them as they herd the animals. But the mobile schools were abolished, and they were reintegrated into the formal system. And according to the people who were consuming this kind of education in the mobile schools, they say integrating mobile schools into the formal education system has affected access. Now, there is also a dilemma of ignoring what makes reforms work. Actually, in most of the countries that I have tried to benchmark, you find that reforms are always originated by the elite spheres of the population and the political elites. Now, the design is done by the government bureaucrats, and the implementers, particularly the schools, the local authorities, come in at the periphery when the reform has already been designed, where some kind of involvement has been achieved. It is not intense enough for the implementers to be able to make better judgment on how to implement the intervention. I will give you an example. There are quite a number of reforms that have been resisted in most of the African countries, including Uganda. One time, Uganda came up with a reform of teaching children in the lower primary school classes in their local languages, because research shows that when children begin school by learning in their local languages, they achieve more and they even learn better the other languages. Now, although it was a good reform, the implementers, including the teachers, school management, were not involved right from the start. And when the reform came, it was so resisted. Some parents looked at it as if it was going to affect their children, because in Uganda, given that we are a British colony, we are former British colony, people take interest in their children speaking English right from their childhood. And so they take schools which do not emphasize children speaking good English as bad schools. Now, when the government came up to say, let children first learn in their local languages, some parents who prefer children to learn in English shifted their children from public schools to private schools. The other policy that has caused a lot of resistance is the recent policy where government increased the salaries of science teachers by 400% and none for teachers of humanities. So what happened? The teachers of humanities resisted and they laid their tools down, saying they are doing the same work as their science counterparts, but the others are earning on the humanities teachers are earning only 25% of the salaries of science teachers, and many other kind of reforms. The other aspect that I wanted to reflect on are the drawbacks. That you want to move forward, you design your reforms, you want to move forward with them and implement them, but there's a lot of things that keep pulling you behind, keep pulling you to the original position you want to leave. And one of them is the political economy of reforms. I must tell you that education is always used as a political tool world over. Governments want to be felt that they are in charge, that they care for their populations by providing education. And so you find that sometimes the political parties that take over power may have biases around reforms that were initiated by maybe outgoing governments. And so this affects so much the reformers because new governments, new office bearers tend to come with their own interests, and they want those interests to be reflected through the education systems. I've told you that when Uganda got independence in 1962, straight away, the political leadership that came in argued that the education system of the time was not meant it wasn't designed to answer some of the development challenges of the population. And so it needed to be aligned to the needs of the people. But whereas that makes a lot of logic, behind it was a lot of political economy, where you bias reforms and make people that if it wasn't you to be in power, then the reforms wouldn't have come. And so the objectivity of reforms is lost along the way. The other drawback that I really realized as a strategist is the disruptors and the pandemics. In developing countries, we plan with a lot of risk and the uncertainty. You can't tell whether you will have a continuous academic year, and you cannot tell sometimes whether the children who are joining will be able to exit as expected because of the emergencies, because of the pandemics that keep coming through. For example, actually Uganda has suffered from war for quite a long time since independence. It's only now that we've enjoyed relatively peaceful country since 1986, but still there have been pockets of instability within the country, and that affects education in those areas. You as well know, or you as well need to know that Uganda hosts the biggest population of refugees in the whole world because we are neighbors to unstable countries like South Sudan, Ethiopia. We are neighbors to DR Congo, which has been at war for quite a long time. We are neighbors to Rwanda. Rwanda had a genocide in 1994. So you find that in such a circumstance, it becomes too hard for reforms to be envisaged, their implementations to be envisaged. For example, as you're planning for the 10 million children in primary schools, you are having a population of children who are supposed to enter primary, but they are refugees at the tune of around 1 million or 2 million. And so that destabilizes, to creates a lot of instability within the kind of assumptions that you are taking. But also, we have had a lot of pandemics. We've had the Ebola pandemic. Recently, we had the COVID, which paralyzed the entire world. And Uganda is known to have locked up schools for 2 years, 2 academic years. And so you find that our children who are in school now lost 2 years. They are older for their grades by 2 years. And during the time when we closed the schools, the teenage pregnancy is shorter. In some districts, teenage pregnancy shot up by a percentage of 300%. That is by a factor of 3. But generally, teenage pregnancies on average raised by around 26%. But like I said, some districts experienced 75% increase and above in teenage pregnancies, because the school is taken as the safe haven for most of these children, given the vulnerability that they experience if they stayed home. And I told you that Uganda is host to the world's biggest population of refugees, and the statistics indicates that 57% of refugees in Uganda still do not have access to education. So while you are planning for reforms to increase access, these factors keep drawing you back. Then there is another drawback that I have noticed. The issue of having high cost of basic education vis-a-vis the presence of compulsory universal education reform in place. I've realized a contradiction in reforms that try to increase access, where government declares free education, but schools have covered or have hidden costs that they continue to charge parents. For example, school uniform, sometimes schools charge for scholastic materials, sometimes they charge for lunch, quite a number of costs. And so even when the reform is meant to make education relatively cheaper and free, tacitly, there are undercurrents that contradict the existing reform. And in the recent study that I led, we found out that the 41% of youth who are neither in employment nor education or training blame high cost of education as the reason for their predicament. And there is now another challenge where basic education is becoming more expensive than tertiary. For example, you find some early years schools charging fees that are higher than our universities charge, and this becomes a very serious drawback. The other drawback that is significant and that bothers education reformers are the gender and cultural norms. You realize that whereas the reforms target all the children, regardless of gender, to enter and remain in school, there are some norms that counter the direction of such a reform. In Uganda, there are some communities that are still patriarchal, and they favor education of boys in the families relative to that of the girls. So you'll find that if a family does not have enough resources to send all the children to school, they will first send the boys, reason being that the girls can marry off while the boys will stay and continue helping the families. But also, the gender roles within families tend to disfavor girls' education. You'll find that when girls come back from school, they'll go and fetch water at a distance. They will have to go and look for firewood to prepare meals at home, and they will support their mothers to prepare food, while the boys may get some time to revise and do homework. The other drawback that I wanted to share about is the issue of the ever declining educational budgets due to competing demands in the midst of wastage within the system. So what I've realized is that whereas resources are dwindling that are going to education, in most of the African countries, you find that even the little that is appropriated to the education sector is not maximally utilized. You find that children enter and leave early. For example, in Uganda, we are having between 38 to 40% of the children who enter in primary schools finishing the primary education cycle. And again, few would transition from primary to secondary. So you find that whereas the resources are becoming meager, but even those few, there are a lot of wastages that are experienced. I just wanted to share this graph, which is showing you that as the enrollment rates are increasing, now we have around 15 million Ugandans in school, steadily the education budget or the education spending is reducing in relative terms. This means that whereas in absolute terms, you see that money appropriated to education is increasing, if you took it as a percentage of the total budget, there is a big decline. And over the past 20 years, the Ugandan proportion of the budget going to education has been reducing while the enrollment rate have been increasing. Now, there is another challenge or drawback that I wanted us to reflect on, and that is the faulty assessment regime. Now, most of the African education systems intend to increase enrollment and ensure that every child of school age-going joins and remains in school. The challenge is that such a reform or such reforms have been countered by the faulty assessment regimes that we use in schools. For example, in Uganda, children sit for national examinations at primary 7. That is the end of the primary school cycle. And it is only those who get certain points or aggregates that are allowed to enter secondary school. Now, that is a contradiction because the reform in Ugandan education requires that children should stay in school for at least 11 years. That is from primary 1 to lower secondary grade 4, which in Britain is around GCSE, something of the sort. But in the middle, again, you have a roadblock that if children do not achieve a certain level within the examinations, they can't cross over to second. And so many children really drop. And what the schools are doing, they are focusing mainly on the test. And they've left implementation of the curriculum. They just look at what is examined and limit their teaching to that. And so that means that the reform notwithstanding, the schools will just continue to pursue better grades such that very many parents can come because of the illusion that such would be a good school. We have another drawback in this country of the rich families colonizing higher education. Now, currently, government gives scholarships to 4,000 students who have scored highly in A-level. I think A-level in Britain either is GCE, something of the sort. But that is the final level before one joins tertiary education. Now, in most cases, we always have something like 120,000 students sitting for GCE or A-levels, but 4,000 will qualify for government scholarships and the rest will have to find their way. Either their families could support them. Now, you find that these 4,000 are coming from premier schools that charge highly and with better infrastructure. So you find that the 4,000 being supported by government are coming from families that can afford to pay. And then the rest who cannot afford to pay are those that are left out. And so you find this dual system where the rich will always have children who have gone to good schools, they've attended university, and end up in good jobs. Of course, government has tried to bring another reform, the quota system, saying, okay, we shall go into the districts to find that every district at least contributes a certain number of children who are joining university. But still, the rich families circumvent that system, and you'll find that even the quota system, those from affluent families are the ones that are joining. The piecemeal curriculum reforms has been a drawback. In my view, an education is a system. Education is a system, just like the body, meaning that the moment I do something on my foot, the whole body is affected. The challenge we've had in the African education systems is that a country takes maybe undertakes curriculum reforms for primary, and then the rest of the system operates as usual. not knowing that the reforms that have come up at lower education system have significant ramifications ahead. Then you may find another time reforms are being done in lower secondary, and then the rest of the system will be left to operate. And that draws back education reforms. Now, I wanted to end the presentation by looking at some of the trade-offs that when you are at the center of reforming educations of poor countries, you need to be aware of. Trade-offs, I use the word trade-offs, meaning trying to cede the original position that he held in order to fit within the circumstances. In Uganda, at the beginning, we traded off when it came to the issue of quantity versus quality. When we declared universal basic education, the institutions that we had were overwhelmed because the schools were fewer than the number of children that were entering. And so you found overcrowded schools, you found higher pupil-teacher ratios, and this compromised the quality indicators, although on the access indicators, we were performing very well. But then the policymakers argued that would it be okay to just pursue quality while a lot of children stayed at home? And so the argument was that let's first get the children in school and then we shall sort out the issue of quality. And that is a trade-off that many countries as well make. Sometimes you have to make a trade-off between short-term and long-term reforms or interventions. Sometimes as government, you may have a long-term view or perspective for addressing a challenge. But then the other spheres of influence, like parents, would want you to fix it yesterday. You may not have enough resources to address it according to the demands of the parents. And so sometimes you try to do some quick fixes, which may not even work very well, rather than taking a long-term view because of the pressures that you get from the other spheres of influences. Then we have another trade-off that we face, the trade-off of promoting science, technology, and innovation vis-a-vis humanities and the arts. Now, African countries now are pursuing science, technology, and innovation, and a lot of funding is being biased towards that, as reflected from biasing the curricula to STI, biasing salary and other remunerations in favor of scientists, biasing the budget towards STI. But we know that not everyone can be a scientist. And so, but because countries believe that until you promote science, you may not develop as expected. So that trade-off happens, where you find that most of the children who are going to pursue the arts may fail to get enough financial support, because most of the support might go to those who are going to pursue STI. So to conclude, our education system in Uganda, and even those of the other former colonies, have gone through a lot of transformations a lot of reforms right from the times of the missionaries. And one interesting thing or intriguing thing is that policy reforms have been characterized by the same themes all through. That is access, quality, skilled manpower, manpower tailored to society needs. Every time, that is what we are trying to chase. And what is interesting is that even when you come up with the new innovations, the drawbacks, the trade-offs tend to overpower the intention to move forward, and then you keep in the same position. You're trying to you come up with reforms for such challenges, but the drawbacks, the kind of trade-offs that you keep making do not allow you to move. And we keep on realizing that still our education systems have not achieved that level at which you can say, yes, at least the system can yield the skills that we need. And some people have said that a lot of countries are training what they don't need, and what they need, they are not training. And personally, I believe that education reformers, to be successful, they will have to understand the drawbacks, the trade-offs, the different persistent challenges, and try as well to understand that the countries that they're trying to design reforms for are not going to get rich tomorrow. And so there is a need to align the reforms, the resources that we do have, to the capacities in terms of technical capacities that we do have, in order to implement the reforms to yield the required outcomes. Thank you very much for listening to me.